Hey everyone, my name is Charlie and today I have my April wrap-up. I have read a fair few books this month. Because of that, I have decided to separate this video into sections. Firstly, I will mention the books that I am not going to talk about because I have talked about them elsewhere, and I will leave links to the videos where I have talked about those books in the description. These books are Girl, Woman, Other by Bernardine Evaristo, Himself by Jess Kidd, Monkey by Wu Ch-eng-En, and Cloud Atlas by David Mitchell. Those were the first 4 books that I read in April. Next we have a stack of books that I can't talk about as I read them for the BookTube prize. I also am including another book in here due to the fact that it was the prequel to one of the books, and I feel like if I gave my thoughts on that book it might spoil how I felt about its sequel. So the book that I'm including here, even though I didn't have to read it for the BookTube prize, is Olive Kitteridge by Elizabeth Strout. And then the books that I had to read for the BookTube prize, and therefore I won't be discussing them until June, are The Nickel Boys by Colson Whitehead, Red at the Bone by Jacqueline Woodson, Queenie by Candice Carty-Williams, The Beekeeper of Aleppo by Christy Lefteri, A Woman is No Man by Etaf Rum, and Olive Again by Elizabeth Strout. This leaves me with this stack of books to talk about. I am not going to discuss these books in order. I have separated these into sections as well, but one book that I'm not going to be going in depth into is The Faithful Dog Gelert, and it was translated by Sean Lewis and illustrated by Robin Lowry, but I don't know who told this story originally. My sister bought me this as a gift when she visited Ben Nevis last year, and so it was only 29 pages. I thought it was longer with it being a hardback, so I sat down to, read what I thought was going to be this folk tale, and I can't say anything about it. Now I am going to talk about the graphic novels that I read in April. I didn't fall into a reading slump, but I was feeling a bit aware that I wasn't reading as much, and I was feeling a bit overwhelmed by this stack of books behind me. Therefore, I chose to read a lot of shorter books that I've had on my TBR. I downloaded a ton of graphic novels when I realised that due to Amazon Prime, Prime Reading, you can actually read a few of them for free. The first of these was Hellboy Volume 1, Seed of Destruction by Mike Mignola and John Byrne. The Hellboy films were some of my favourite when I was younger. I've always liked that twist on fantasy, and this was darker, grittier and more comedic. Then I watched the reboot earlier this year and said how it inspired my love of Hellboy again. I have never read the comic books, however. Now I have done that, and having seen the Hellboy film, the most recent one, I felt like it was a very faithful adaptation of the comic book because there was nothing that I hadn't yet seen. I appreciated getting to see this, how it looked on the page, the visual, the artistry, and the way it was written. I think that every adaptation I've seen so far has been able to capture that blend of humour, horror and fantasy, and I'm looking forward to reading some more of these graphic novels in future. Then I read Karmzah the Unleashing, and that is by Farida Bedwei. I adored this. This follows the character of Marawa Ajay, and she's an archaeologist who has cerebral palsy. And one day, some of her fellow archaeologists return from a dig and leave her with this urn. She accidentally breaks this urn, unleashing this spirit who imbues her with powers to become a superhero. And so her crutches that she has to use to walk become imbued with magical powers. She gets this strength, and it's magic and power that also comes with its own set of limits. I didn't get enough from this story. This was humorous and it was a great origin story, and it went incredibly quickly and it felt very much like it could have been an animated TV show. I wish there were more issues of it for me to go and download now. It just made me smile throughout. Then I read Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 1 Cosmic Avengers, and this has Brian Michael Bendis, Steve McKivitt as an illustrator, Yves Bigarel as an illustrator, Michael Avon Oeming as an illustrator. I had to look those up, and I'm sorry about it. This is clearly one of those graphic novels that has been inspired by the latest Marvel films. And so the team is made up of the Guardians of the Galaxy that people have seen from the film. Admittedly, that was the reason that I chose to read it. I'm not sure what this bind-up compiled, but there was this very evident shift in illustration style, and it seemed to be heading towards one story and then stopped in the middle and went back to show the band getting back together, and I just didn't get it. Like, it was fun, it was comedic, and it discussed themes of parental disappointment and how these guardians are trying to impress their fathers. It went back into their backstories, and I appreciated that, and I thought for the most part that it was strong, but there was this shift in the middle that didn't make sense to me, and then it just ended out of nowhere. I think obviously they want you to go on and read them, buy more. I might do that. I just don't think that I was invested enough. I read it, it was free, and I liked the Guardians of the Galaxy when I watched the film, but is it something I want to dedicate much time to in future? I don't know, maybe if I'm looking for something fast to read. Then I read the first Chilling Adventures of Sabrina graphic novel. As I was just trying to find the author, I couldn't find the one that I read, but apparently Sarah Rees Brennan has adapted some into novels, and I used to like her, so I might be reading them in future. I don't know. The reason I say this is because whilst I think that this was definitely a dark take on witches and it was great to see and I really enjoyed that, I also don't feel like this graphic novel really actually went far. It was a lot of setup, and I think that it's catering towards the fans of the TV show and hoping they will continue to read. So whilst there's a twist at the end, everything felt as though it was building up to something, and we never really got to meet the character of Sabrina that we're going to be meeting throughout the rest of the graphic novels. Fortunately, more of them were available to read for free on my Kindle, so I have them there should I choose to read them. Those were the graphic novels that I read in April. Now let's move on to the poetry. The first book that I don't want to give much time to is Old Possum's Book of Practical Cats by T.S. Eliot. This is the poetry collection that inspired Cats. I did not know this. I originally purchased this from the charity shop because I wanted to see whether Dane of Dane Reads would like to read it, simply because he likes cats. Turns out he already had it. Either way, I thought it was short, I'd give it a read. It's T.S. Eliot. I didn't realise that T.S. Eliot was racist, and that comes up in this novel. It came up so much that I actually decided to go and research whether I was actually just being too sensitive about the issue. I even recorded a video that I don't think I'll share because it was difficult for me to properly formulate my thoughts, but this book led me to question whether we can ever separate art from the artist, because doing some research into T.S. Eliot's life, I discovered that as a poet he would absolutely despise me. I'm working class and I'm a bit liberal, and he hated everybody who wasn't white and upper class and male. And I just don't know whether you can ever separate the art from the artist, because surely then you're saying, I like the art enough that I can accept their horrible views and the things that they've said. And it brought up this question for me that I don't think I properly managed to understand or get across in that video. Also, at the same time, I do not believe that the poems in here are that good. Yes, there is some rhyme, but for the most part, they were nonsense rhymes, and I can imagine that this would be humorous to children. I think that that's why it was written. I think most people who read this nowadays might read it because it's T.S. Eliot or because they have a love of cats. I have neither of those things. Honestly, some of the rhymes were forced, and some of them, even though they were supposed to be jolly, jaunty and funny, I had my experience marred by the fact that I'd read this racism, and indeed he made this racist joke too often for me not to notice it and comment on it here. So there's that one. Then we have 3 Simon Armitage collections. The first of these that I read is Seeing Stars. This is the one that I don't know whether you can call it a poetry collection, because whilst I enjoyed the writing, for the most part to me it felt more like monologues and flash fiction. Simon Armitage is still a great writer. Maybe I haven't read enough poetry in my lifetime, and maybe I shouldn't have such a prescriptive view of what poetry is. I don't think I do, but this is just me acknowledging what some other people who love this collection might think. Like I say, I enjoyed it. It reminded me of the absurd things that I really like in literature, but like I say, I just did not think that this was poetical in any way. Then I read Kid. I realised that I read the title poem of this for GCSE, which reminded me of the fact that I had had to study Simon Armitage at school, and because of that I'd been put off reading him. But then I ended up reading him as someone who's interested in poetry and a lot older, and I feel like I appreciated his work a lot more. it felt more modern to me than I had anticipated it would do. Once again, he astounds me with the form in which he writes, with his half rhyme and his rhythm. And whilst I thought I would end up giving away my Simon Armitage copies once I had read them, I've actually ended up appreciating the poet a lot more than I thought, so I'm going to end up keeping these and rereading them in future. But also throughout this one, there are poems related to this character of Mr. Robinson. I'm not sure whether he has appeared further, but I do want to go back and find out the context of that character, because he definitely goes through it in these poems. Then we have Killing Time. And Lord, the way that this was written, I thought I'd found a really recent collection. I thought that this must have been written about the last few years. And it turns out that this was written in 1999. And I could not believe it, because a lot of the stuff that he is talking about is still prevalent today. And a lot of the issues that are in here, we're still having issues with over 20 years later. I appreciated the way that this was written. It's a 1,000-line poem, and it's broken up into different ways, and it goes through the entire gamut of life in England at the time, if not the world. Again, I'm a fan of Simon Armitage, but he had a lot more time, well, in this one poem, to explore a lot of themes, and it just made me feel more in awe of his skill as a poet. And then we have Playing with Fire by Greval Lindop. This is a book that I borrowed off Joy. I really enjoyed the poet's poetry. I enjoyed his rhythm. I enjoyed his half rhyme. I enjoyed his wordplay. And then the poems got sexual. I felt embarrassed to be sat in the same room reading these poems. Like, me mum and dad were in the same room as me. And there's an entire section where he's talking about pole dancers and their names and what they do for him. And then you have... There was one. What was it called? The poem called Pearls was when it first started to occur to me that he was talking about sex, and I thought, hang on a minute, this is pretty dirty. And then honestly, embarrassment set in at that one. The embarrassment came from the fact that Joy had lent this book to me. I was thinking, what exactly is she trying to say here? This man, his poetry is fantastic. Again, there is just so much going into this, and you get a sense of character from the poems. As I say, the writing was great, but that embarrassment did come when he started going on about the sex and the pole dancing. It was just hot under the collar type stuff. I won't lie to you. I'm constantly amazed by the poets who decide to write about sex. I'm just thinking, you're going to be reading this in public. Now, I did think that I had more non-fiction to talk about than I do, but I don't. I just have the two books. So firstly, I'm going to talk about Women and Power by Mary Beard. This is just two essays about Mary Beard's experience with the power struggle that shouldn't be there throughout history, and using her knowledge as a classicist to discuss this and note how it has appeared in ancient Greek tales. This has been used continually through our media to silence women, and then she uses it to discuss Twitter. The only issue I had was, whilst this is incredibly short and you can read it in about half an hour, I felt as though all the points were made, but then there was no conclusion, if that makes sense. And I don't know whether there was supposed to be a conclusion, but I was on board with everything she was saying, but I also knew it was happening. I don't know who this book was aimed towards, because I agree with everything she says, but at the same time, I don't feel like any sort of conversation could be formulated from this. Maybe as like an introduction to feminism and Greek myths and Greek stories, Greek tales, then this will be a good book, but I don't know. I did find some further Greek tales that I didn't previously know about, so I suppose that's good. And then we have Legendary Children, The First Decade of RuPaul's Drag Race and the Last Century of Queer Life by Tom Fitzgerald and Lorenzo Marquez. Have you ever felt like a book should be required reading? Because that's how I feel about this book. I saw this book first, I can't remember whether I saw this on Matthew Sharopa's channel or whose channel I saw it on first, but as soon as I saw it, I knew that I had to have it. If you didn't know, I'm a big RuPaul's Drag Race fan. And reading this and knowing where they got the idea of challenges from, and knowing more about the queer history that came behind all of the decisions on that show was great. It was informative, and this book, as they say, is just a starting off point for readers to go and do more research into queer history, which is something that I really ought to have done more of, and I hope to take advantage of the index in the back of this of places to go, stuff to watch, read, all that fun stuff. The only issue I did have was there are a few errors about RuPaul's Drag Race. Few facts were wrong, unless you're like a huge fan, you weren't going to notice that. I gained knowledge from this book. It wasn't an impenetrable read. It discussed more of the difficult topics that I don't think that we discuss much or we have forgotten about because we believe that life is easier. I'm grateful it exists and will definitely be looking to give this a reread in future. And definitely, like I say, this book should be required reading. A very easy, fast read. Fantastic. So we only have one audiobook this month, and that is Feet of Clay by Terry Pratchett, the something in the Discworld series. This is another book featuring the City Watch, and I thought it was fantastic. We had another sort of murder mystery book that was told in Terry Pratchett's rather humorous style, and there are some issues in here discussing women on the force, and I thought that this was a great way to do that, especially the time that this book came out and what they were actually talking about, and using humour to discuss that idea. Really adore these characters. I am currently listening to Jingo, which is the next one. I found that the City Watch books are some of my favourite of Terry Pratchett's, which isn't something I expected when I first started this Discworld journey years ago. I am just thrilled to be continuing with his stories because they are full of magic and mystery and humour, and that is just my bag, so great stuff. Then I want to talk about Bottled Goods by Sophie Van Leeuwen. This was sent to me by Charlie Brooke a few months ago when she told me that she didn't get on with this, and I thought, well, it's weird, it's absurd, it's just the sort of thing that I like to read. Unfortunately, it didn't do it for me. On the back of this, it says that it is magical realism. Magic takes place, and I definitely think that it follows the ideas behind magical realism in that the magic is there as being against some sort of restrictive regime. This is before the Romanian Revolution, which I am not knowledgeable about at all, but it was difficult to read certain parts of these characters' stories. They're leading very difficult lives, and actually I read this at the same time as reading The Man Who Saw Everything by Deborah Levy, which also discusses similar topics but around the same time. And so I think had I not read the Deborah Levy before this, which I will talk about in a minute, I might have enjoyed this book more, but because I'd read two books that were very similar, very close together, it might have marred my experience. I think that there was a definite sense of tension in here. It's a very fast read, it can be done in 2 hours, but at the same time this is a whole load of flash fiction used to tell a story, and because of that I don't think that the story was told in the best possible way. I like weird and I like wacky. I could have liked this book more. It's sticking with me, but not for the right reasons. And that very well could have been because of The Man Who Saw Everything by Deborah Levy, which is fantastic and is basically one of my new favourite books. A man is hit by a car in the 1980s. He happens to jog on to Berlin, where he falls in love with a man. So originally, I thought I was just getting a very straightforward love story, and I was put off by that. But as this story went on, certain things began to happen that had me feeling as though I was in the episode of Buffy where she is in a psychiatric home in one world and you don't know whether it's actually real or whether she is actually just imagining all of this. This book came with this sense of unreality that added to tension and added to this sense of sorrow because we were inside this character's head, inside all of his confusion, unable to put these jigsaw pieces of the world back together. And again, I found a book that called for a reread to try and figure this book out and try and help to rebuild this character. Great character study, great story, great writing, surprised me in the best possible way. And so that's The Man Who Saw Everything by Deborah Levy. There are other people who have given it much better reviews than I have done, and I will leave links to them in the description. But then I read The Accident on the A35 by Graham McRae Burnett. This book is basically, apparently, a sequel. I didn't know that going in. And it's told as though this is the manuscript of a late writer, and this book was sent to a publisher upon the writer's death, and then we go into this book that he had written. and it's supposed to be a bit like a riff on the Maigret books and some of the classic European mystery novels of the last 100 years. I was thoroughly enjoying this until the conclusion, because I don't feel like this book has an ending or a satisfying ending. Maybe it was supposed to be literary. I don't know, but I don't feel like this story has a resolution. I feel like we had the climax, the book ended, and then we had this afterword that was supposed to be by someone pretending to be the publisher, talking about how they don't know whether the events of this book could have taken place. They don't know whether the events of the books are biographical. However, because of that, because of this very poor resolution, the book ended up not doing much for me. Similarly to the next book, Riot Baby by Tochi Onyebuchi. I really was looking forward to this book. This book was written in such a way that I believed it was set in the future, and then to find out that it was actually based in the present, the here and now, was heartbreaking, but not unbelievable. I like how this book ended, but I did feel like I wanted more from this book. This feels like a great polemic about the injustice done to black people in America. Aleppo is born with this thing, which is a power, and she seems to have tons of different powers that are explored throughout the entirety of this book. This book is a great piece of science fiction in that it uses the science fiction to discuss the world in which we live. However, I feel like I only got the bare bones of these characters. I think that the tone of this book was perfectly correct for the story that was being told. And that's where I have all these different questions with this book. Maybe I need to have a discussion with somebody about it, somebody else who's read it. Because there are so many parts of this book that I adored, but at the same time, towards the end of this book, it felt like a flash in the pan of a story. I would have liked to see it more fleshed out than it was. But then I suppose the authorial intent was just to show us what has happened, what is happening, and the way the world could go. I don't know, it was open-ended, and I suppose that allows the reader the space to create their own opinions. If you have been following me this month, then you will have seen a video called Reading Harry Potter in Italian. And that was where I attempted to read the first chapter of Harry Potter e la Pietra Filosofale in Italian. Well, it's the Italian edition. And I haven't done any further reading of that book because I want to expand my knowledge of Italian. Each day I seem to be having more breakthroughs with the understanding I have of the language, and then sometimes it feels like I'm just failing. It will be something I continue, and I do plan on still reading that book. I thought about doing this entire section in Italian, but my knowledge of the language is not there yet. I try and speak in Italian. I have to think about formulating the sentences properly in my head for the longest time, and I'm hoping to really shorten that and get that quicker. Either way, have you read any of these books? If you have and you would like to discuss them, then please feel free to do so in the comments. I hope that you have enjoyed this video, and until next time, that is all. In termini di Harry Potter e la Pietra Filosofali, io non ho leggo di più quel libro, come non conosco abbastanza della lingua, ma io continuerò a imparare e spero di leggere il tutto in futuro. Spiacente.